It's time now for our news review segment where we take a look at one of our stories in more detail. The Iranian president slams sanctions as a new form of domination, calling for a collective response from independent nations to counter such measures.
Sanctioning nations is a common form of new domination, and countering it requires cooperation of sovereign states and a collective response. Otherwise, sanctions will affect all countries, even US allies, under various pretexts.
Ibrahim Raisi announced sanctions as part of a broader agenda to undermine sovereign states. The Iranian president noted that independent nations are experiencing a historic growth in power, while the US is suffering its weakest position. In a reference to the 2015 deal known as the JCPOA, Raisi said Tehran is serious about reaching an agreement only if the other signatories are serious about removing sanctions in an effective and practical manner.
We are not satisfied with anything less than our rights. The Islamic Republic of Iran is serious about reaching an agreement if the other parties are serious about removing the sanctions effectively and operationally.
Raisi reiterated that based on a decree from the leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution, nuclear weapons have no place in the country's military doctrine. He made the remarks in an address to the lower house of the Russian parliament on the second and final day of his official visit to Moscow. Raisi said Iran is seeking maximum interaction with all countries around the world, especially its neighbors and allies. He once again called for further expansion of ties between Tehran and Moscow. This, he said, can help prevent the presence of third parties in the region and help sustain regional peace and stability. Joining us is Richard Becker from the Answer Coalition from San Francisco, and also Jason Unruhe, a political commentator from Niagara Falls. Gentlemen, welcome. Richard, if I start with you, it's one sentence from the Iranian president's speech that stands out, where he says that independent nations are experiencing a historic power, or growth in power, I should say, while the US is suffering its weakest position. And that may not necessarily relate to economics, or financial position. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's true. If we look at the situation in historical perspective, it was 70 years ago that the U.S. and Britain imposed a blockade and a complete embargo on the sale of oil, of Iranian oil, after the Mossadegh government had nationalized the oil fields. And that created chaos in the economy and led to the downfall of the Mossadegh government within a relatively short period of time, within a couple of years or a little bit less. Now we see the sanctions that are being imposed, but they're not having that same result. They are having the result of creating incredible suffering on the population and in causing, just all kinds of hardships for people. It's terrible. It's a crime. I really believe it should be considered, I think these kind of sanctions should be considered a crime against humanity. But they're not having the desired effect of bringing about regime change, because that's what the U.S. policy really has been ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. It's been regime change. They're not succeeding in that, and I think that shows us that the relationships of power have shifted and are continuing to shift.
Right. And then Jason, President Raisi also says sanctions are part of a broader agenda to undermine sovereign states. It's words that, sovereign states, independent states, democratic states, those who have elections, they're the ones who are the target of American sanctions, not dictatorships or authoritarian regimes.
Well, no. whether or not they're democratic is completely irrelevant. Whether or not they have a good human rights record or not is irrelevant. It's a matter of whether or not they're going to carry out American interests. Obviously, many countries are horribly despotic. For example, Saudi Arabia, and they never place any sanctions upon them and any of the barbarous acts that they commit, because this isn't really about whether or not someone's democratic. This is not really about whether someone respects or disrespects human rights. It's about carrying out U.S. interests, and particularly in this case, U.S. imperialist interests. And anyone who doesn't bow to just do whatever it is that the United States wants them to do, whoever is not willing to be a client state, regardless of their political ideology, regardless of their economic status, those are the ones that are going to be targeted by the United States for sanctions. Now, of course, human rights, etc., are often used as a justification for doing so, but I don't see that as being really the case. That's just an excuse. I mean, nobody with a serious face can point to Venezuela or Iran and say that they're an evil, despotic, dictatorship, while in the same breath turn around and say that Saudi Arabia is a bastion of freedom and democracy, or even Israel for that matter. So it is very clear actual integrity is not what this is about. This is about forwarding U.S. imperialist interests. And as long as you're willing to serve the U.S. empire, you are not the ones who are going to be sanctioned by the United States and its near monopolistic position on world trade, particularly with regards to payment systems.
Right. And then, Richard, somewhere in President Raisi's speech was some free advice to countries in the East and the West, that at some point, the United States, or you can't really depend on the United States for security and other aspects. How much is the U.S. concerned about its decline as an empire, or has that empire already collapsed?
Well, I don't think it's collapsed. The U.S. remains the #1 military power in the world, and is a very, a big economic power as well. But certainly the U.S. position has declined, and U.S. doctrine, as exemplified in the national security strategy, a number of them over the years, going back to the months immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, has been that there should be the center core of the doctrine has been that there should be one superpower in the world, and no other country should be allowed to rise to challenge the U.S. position of the sole superpower after the fall of the USSR. So this is what really moves U.S. policy in many ways. I agree with your other guests that if you follow, you do what the U.S. Leaders and the ruling elite in the U.S. want you to do, you don't get sanctioned. But you have just absurd rationale, like this whole idea that we are in competition with China over the who will win the 21st century. That has nothing to do with the interests of the people, and we, the people, have no possible standing in that. This is all about the domination, global domination, and the fact that China has grown in strength, Iran has grown in strength, Russia has grown in strength. These are seen as being challenges to global hegemony on the part of the United States.
Interesting points, Richard. And Jason, Richard, their notes of that the United States is a military power. Jason, can you remember the last time that the United States won militarily?
I'm sure there's probably some small conflict. Like they technically defeated the military of Iraq, but that's not really saying much. That considering the size difference between the two militaries as well as access to resources. Well, the United States is very good at essentially beating up people who have very limited ability to defend themselves. But when it comes to actual real stand-up wars, the United States has a much more difficult time in that regard. For example, the reason there hasn't been any large-scale military conflict against Iran has largely to do with the Millennium Challenge. That was a simulation done in 2002 where the United States simulated a war with Iran, and in every possible scenario, the United States actually lost the war until they created a scenario that they essentially could not lose in. That's on Wikipedia. That's available for anybody to read. I think that despite the arrogance of much of the political leadership, I think the military leadership is aware of many of its limitations in what it can and can't do.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts and your contribution. Let me thank our guests for their time. Richard Becker is from the Answer Coalition, joining us from San Francisco, and Jason Unruhe, a political commentator from Niagara Falls. And that brings an end to another edition of the News Review.